Good evening, dear insomniac. Come in. It's a quiet sort of night, not the tense kind of still, where the whole world is holding its breath, waiting for something. The easy kind, where nothing's coming and nothing's expected, and the meadow has simply decided to say nothing for a while. Every so often, the wind gets up and goes round the eaves in one long, slow pass. And if it finds the chimney just right, it makes a sound I can only call distant surf, which is a strange thing to hear, this far from any coast. But then it settles again, and the quiet comes back in behind it, deeper than before. It put me in mind of the sea, so I've spent most of this evening down at the wellspring, the river wing. You may not have come this far into the library before. It's where the same river that runs through the meadow outside comes right through the building and opens into a place all its own. A wide, quiet stretch, with grass along the bank and cool stone underfoot, and shelves built down close to the water's edge, as though the books don't mind the company. Most nights, there's a bit of a gathering down here. Someone starts a story, and someone else adds to it, and before long the whole bank's caught up in it. But not tonight. Tonight the water's gone flat as poured glass, and there's no one about but me, and now you. And just off the main bank, where the shelves bend away into a quieter corner, there's a nook where the sea stories have gathered. All the tales with salt water in them seem to drift down over the years and settle there, nearest the water. Like tends to find like in a place like this. It's the faintest bit briny in that corner, if you go looking for it. Just a hint of salt underneath the damp stone. Nothing that carries past the shelves. And that's where I found this. A thin one, cloth bound, the corners gone soft, the pages stiff along the outer edge. The way paper goes when it's been damp once, long ago, and dried slowly since. No name on the spine. No name inside it either. No author, no printer, no date. And here's the thing I keep turning over. No place. Not one. There's a harbour in it, and it's never named. A coast that could be any coast. And I'd wager a good deal. The man in it isn't going by the name he was born with. That's not carelessness. Somebody left all of that out on purpose and took some trouble over it. This is a book that keeps quiet about everything, right down to where it happened. And it does it so thoroughly that you understand, before you've read a word, that the keeping quiet is rather the whole point. Now, I could have carried it back up to the fire the way I usually would, but it's a sea story, and it seemed a shame to read a sea story anywhere but by the water, and the water, as it happens, was already right here. So find yourself a spot on the bank. Dip your feet in the shallows if you like. The river's never minded. There's tea gone quiet by the lamp if you want it. And no need to say so if you don't. We can be quiet about it together. This one's called For Silence Beckons. Settle in. There was once a fisherman named Corin. He lived in a low white cottage, right at the edge of the sea, and he was, by every measure anyone would have thought to apply, entirely unremarkable. He had built the cottage himself. That was the one thing about it worth remarking on, and he had built it in a spot every sensible person in the harbour told him was too close to the water. Everyone else lived up the hill, tucked back behind the dunes where the wind couldn't get at them. Everyone except Corin. He'd put his one small house down on the low shoulder of land where the last of the meadow ran out and the shingle began. So close that on the big tides the spray came right up onto his step, and the whole place smelled of salt and seaweed and cold, clean air the year round. His window looked at nothing but the sea. He'd built it that way on purpose. He loved the water past all good sense. He wanted to wake up in it and go to sleep in it. and never once in his life did he regret the choice, not even on the nights it tried to come in through the door. He was not the best fisherman in the harbour, nor the worst. He took his small boat out most mornings before the light, and brought her back most afternoons with enough in the hold to get by on, and rarely much more. He mended his own nets, badly but stubbornly. He drank 1 cup of ale on the harbour wall of an evening, and listened far more than he talked, which is a rarer quality than people give it credit for, and which meant everyone in that town liked Corin a good deal, without ever having quite worked out why. He was a quiet man. That's the short of it. Not shy, and not sad. Just quiet, the way some people are. The way a still pond is quiet. Not empty, only settled. The fog came in the autumn, and it came without asking. He was further out than usual that afternoon, working a patch of sea that had been good to him, and he'd let it get later than he meant to. He noticed the light going soft before he noticed why, and then the far edge of the sea simply wasn't there anymore. It had gone the same pale grey as the sky, with no line between them. And the grey came on across the water toward him quietly, the way a curtain is drawn across a window from the far side. By the time it reached him, he could see about a boat's length in any direction. After that, nothing but grey, and the grey moving. Corin was not a man to lose his head. He cut the engine and listened for the harbour bell and watched the run of the little swell to take his bearings from it. But the fog does something strange to a sea and to a man in it. It takes away every sound but the ones close by, and it turns the water featureless, so that after a while you cannot tell whether the swell is coming from the west, or whether you have quietly turned yourself around and it's coming from the east. He went one way for a time, and the fog stayed the same. He stopped and listened and heard nothing at all. Not the bell, not the surf on the point, not a gull. Just the silence, close and grey on every side, and the silence he began to feel, though he'd have been ashamed to say it out loud, seemed to be pulling at him, beckoning almost, the way a lit doorway beckons at the end of a dark street, as though, if he only went a little further into it, something would be there. He'd got himself thoroughly lost, and the weather behind the fog was starting to turn. He could feel the swell lengthening under him, growing a longer, uglier stride. And he knew, in the cold, practical part of him, that a lost man on a turning sea is a man in real trouble. That was when the water broke beside the boat, with a small, soft sound, and she was there, just her head and her shoulders, arm's length from the side of the boat, water running off her, grey light on her dark, wet hair. Corin did not shout or fall backward, or do any of the things a man in a story is supposed to do. He was too tired, and too frightened, and too far past being surprised by anything. He simply looked at her, and she looked at him, and for a long moment the two of them stayed exactly like that, in the middle of all that grey. Then she lifted one arm, clear of the water, and pointed. Off past his shoulder, into the fog, where there was nothing to see. He understood her, the way you understand someone across a language you don't share. Not the words, but the whole shape of the thing at once. That way. Home is that way. Follow. So he followed. He put the engine to its slowest and kept her pale shape just ahead and to one side, surfacing and going under and surfacing again. Always pointing. Always a little further on. She led him through the grey for the better part of an hour, patient with him, waiting when he fell behind, and slowly, so slowly he didn't trust it at first. The sound of the surf on the point came up out of the silence ahead. The fog thinned to a paleness, and he could see the loom of the land. He was nearly home, and that was when the weather that had been building behind the fog finally arrived. All at once, the way the worst of them do, no warning left to give, because it had used the fog to hide behind. The wind came round hard. The long, ugly swell stood up and started to break, and his small boat, which was old and honest and had never been meant for a sea like that, went up the face of one wave and came apart on the back of the next. There was a great deal of noise and a great deal of cold, and then, quite suddenly, there was almost none. He was under. It was not violent down there. That was the strangest part, and the part he thought about most in the seasons after. Above him, the whole world was tearing itself to pieces, and down here it was quiet and dim and green and going gently darker. And Corin, who had never once been able to hold his breath for long, understood with perfect calm that he had run out of surface to reach for. And then something took hold of him under both arms. He went up so fast the water sang past his ears. He broke into the noise again and got one enormous ragged breath, and then another, and he was no longer sinking through the middle of it. Something was holding him up. Something was moving him, fast and steady, at an angle across the run of the waves that no swimmer he had ever seen could have managed. He got his eyes open once. For about a second and a half, he saw her face, close to his, turned away, looking ahead at where they were going. Dark hair, flat and streaming, and below the surface, where the water went pale and turning, something long and silver dark, moving with a slow, immense, unhurried power. One beat, and then another, each one shoving them both forward through half a wave. Then his eyes shut against the salt, and he lost track of things. The next he knew, he was on shingle. His own shingle, the little curved beach right below his cottage. So close he could see the dark shape of his own house up against the last of the sky. The sea shoved at his boots and let go, shoved and let go. It was full dark by then. He got up onto his elbows and was thoroughly, wretchedly sick, and then lay a while with his cheek on the wet stones, breathing. When he lifted his head, there was nothing behind him but black water and white spray. Except, out past the near rocks, low in the swell, something was watching. He was almost sure of it. It was there for the space of one long breath, no more than a shape and a pale smudge that might have been a face. Then a wave stood up in front of it, and it was gone. He crawled up the shingle to his own door, soaked through, with a great sounding hollow where his boat used to be. The harbour learned of it the next morning, and made rather a lot of noise about it, and they wanted to know how. And Corin, who had never told a lie of any consequence in his life, said the fog had turned him around, and the sea had taken the boat, and he'd got a hand to something floating and washed up on his own beach. And he supposed he'd been lucky. It was the finest lie ever told in that harbour, and nobody suspected it for a moment, because it was told by Corin. He got another boat by the spring, an old one, smaller, that he rebuilt through the winter, and when the weather turned fair, he took her out to the place he'd gone down, and cut the engine, and sat there. He didn't fish. He'd brought nothing to fish with. He sat in the middle of that patch of ordinary blue water, and felt like an enormous fool, and then he leaned over the side and said, out loud, that he was grateful, and that if there was anything he had that would be of use, he'd like it said now. Because he wasn't much good at guessing. Nothing happened. Gulls went over. The water did what water does. He came back the next week, and the week after, all through that first summer, and slowly he learned the shape of the thing, though it took him a while. She did not come to noise. On the days he arrived cross, or in a hurry, or with the engine ticking over, nothing. It was only when he was still, and the water was still, and he had sat long enough that even his own thoughts had gone quiet, that the surface would do that small, soft thing beside the boat. So he learned to be quiet, properly quiet, cut the engine early, ship the oars, and wait, and want nothing. Until the whole evening had gone as silent as the inside of a shell. He got very good at it. It was, he thought, the only useful skill his whole quiet life had ever been in training for. And the silence would beckon her up. It went slowly, as it had to. They had nothing in common but the water, and no words at all to begin with. And it took the better part of a year to build the crossing between them, plank by plank, out of gestures and objects and patience. He learned that she liked to be shown things. Anything. It hardly mattered what, so long as it was new. He brought a brass button, and a lemon, which she smelled once, looked at him with an expression of frank betrayal, and handed straight back. He brought his father's pocket watch, and she held it flat against the side of her head, with her eyes half shut, listening to the tick of it, and would not give it back for the longest time. And when at last he reached an open hand out toward her, slow, palm up, not taking it, only asking. She looked at the hand and looked at the watch and surrendered it, as though she were doing him an enormous kindness. He brought a small hand mirror, and that was an afternoon he never forgot. The way she went utterly still when she caught her own face in it and turned it this way and that, and then, after a long while, turned it slowly round to point at him instead, as if to say she'd worked out exactly how it functioned and wasn't nearly so impressed by the second subject. He brought a bell off an old bridle, which was the great triumph of that whole first year. She held it the better part of an hour, ringing it under the water, and then above it, and then with her ear pressed hard against it, working out where in it the sound was kept. And once, in the deep of winter, he brought a jar packed full of fresh snow. Because it had struck him that morning that she had almost certainly never once touched the stuff, she put a finger in it, and then her whole hand, and then she looked up at him with an expression he had no name for at all, which he decided later was probably the nearest. A face like hers ever came to laughing. She brought things too, always the moment she surfaced, held up in one fist like a fee. Sea glass, worn soft, a spiraled shell, the colour of a sunrise, a spoon, badly bent and black with age, that had certainly come off a wreck, and which he kept on his kitchen shelf, a pale, knotted tangle of weed that, when he cupped it in his hands in the dark, gave off the faintest cold green light of its own. He sat out an extra hour that night, just holding it, and she lay in the water and watched him do it, looking thoroughly pleased with herself. She had a great sense of her own cleverness, he came to understand. She liked best to bring him things she knew perfectly well he could not otherwise have, and she plainly enjoyed his face at the moment he understood he couldn't. Once she came up quick as anything and set a small live crab down on the seat beside him with the air of presenting a great and generous gift, and then hung on the side of the boat to watch him deal with it. And once, a plain gold ring, which he turned over twice and gave back to her, shaking his head, because he had a feeling about where it had come from and thought somebody down there ought to keep it. She went still at that. Then she pressed the flat of her hand once against the side of the boat, the way she did when a thing had landed right, and took the ring back down into the dark. It was the first time he was certain he'd been understood, rather than merely watched, and beyond the showing, they simply spent time. That was the whole of it, most days, and the best of it. Some evenings he fished, and she lay along the surface a little way off and watched him work with the mild interest of someone watching a man do a chore in a way she'd plainly have done better. Some evenings he brought nothing at all, and the two of them just idled there while the light went down, him leaning over the side, her with her chin on her folded arms against the hull, not needing to do anything, because the company was the thing they'd come for. And some evenings, she sang, he never had words for it. He tried, alone, on the walk up from the boat, and gave it up. It was not words, or not words he could hold. It came up out of the water, low and strange and turning back on itself. And it was the one sound in all that quiet, the only thing the silence let through, and it went straight into the middle of him and sat there. He would find, some mornings, that he'd been humming a stray thread of it without knowing, and could never once get it right, and never quite lost it either. He came to think of it as the fairest trade there'd ever been. She had a voice that could reach him across everything they couldn't say, and in return, he had the one thing he could give her that was worth anything at all, which was his silence. Because talk got around that harbour, as talk does. Not about Corin. Nobody watched Corin closely enough for that. Yet there was talk. There always had been, up and down that coast. Lights under the water at the turn of the tide. A shape on the far rocks that wasn't a seal. A boy who swore blind he'd been sung at, from the fog. Old talk. Worn smooth from handling. Believed by nobody in daylight, and by everybody at 2 in the morning. And one summer, the talk got a little louder, and a gentleman came down from inland to hear it. A perfectly pleasant man. That was the difficulty. Polite, clever, greatly interested, with money to spend on boats and the men who ran them. He was not cruel, and did not think of himself as a hunter. He was only curious. He wanted to know. To be the one who knew. And he could not conceive of a single reason why anyone would object to being known about. He came to Corin too, because Corin had been on that water longer than most, and there Corin found the one use, at last, for a lifetime of being quiet. He didn't have to lie well. He only had to say nothing, and go on saying nothing, the way he always had. And nobody in the world can pry a secret out of a man who was never going to tell them anything anyway. He shrugged and said he'd been out there years and never seen a thing he couldn't name, and let the subject go past him like weather, but it shook him more than he let anyone see, and it made him careful in a way he had never had to be before. He did not go out to her that night. He did not go the next either. For as long as the gentleman was in town, Corin kept away from the water altogether. Didn't so much as stand too long at his own window looking out at it, in case there was a man somewhere with nothing better to do than notice which way a quiet fisherman liked to look. He waited until the gentleman had grown bored and gone back inland, empty-handed. And then he waited longer still, until the harbour had forgotten the whole business, and the talk had gone back to sleep, and there was no reason on earth for anyone to be paying him the slightest attention. Only then, on a night as black and empty as he could find, did he row out. He sat in the quiet until she came, and he looked at her a long while, at how easily she'd been found, out here, by anyone patient enough and cruel enough to simply wait. And he made her a promise. Though she had no way of knowing it was one, he said it out loud, low, the way you say a thing you mean to keep, that as long as he drew breath, no one would ever learn of her from him. Not a soul, not one word, not to anyone, not ever. She watched his mouth make the sounds, and didn't understand a syllable of it, and reached up and rested her hand flat against the hull a moment, the way she did, and slid back down. He kept it. That was the thing about Corin. he kept it. Then came the winter. He broke his leg. It was nothing to do with the sea, which he always thought was the great joke of it. It was a ladder, and a patch of ice on his own step, and a bad twist of the ankle as he came down, and then a long, ugly fall, and a snap he heard before he felt, and a night on the cold shingle, calling for help that came slow, because he lived so far from everyone else. They set it, and it healed, but it took the better part of a season, and for all that long stretch he could not so much as get down to the water's edge, let alone put a boat out. He hated it more than he'd hated anything in his life. Not the pain, the window, because he could see the sea from his bed. He'd built the house for exactly that, and every evening the light went down over the water the way it always had, calm and quiet and beckoning, and he could not go to it. He lay there and watched the still evenings come and go, one after another, the good, grey, settled ones, the ones that were hers, and he thought about her surfacing beside an empty patch of water where his boat used to be, and finding nobody, and waiting, and going down again, and coming back, and finding nobody. He thought about that a great deal, and it was worse than the leg by a long way. He didn't know that she had already begun to look for him. She had felt the wrongness of it before he could have guessed. The long, blank string of evenings, with no boat, no bell, no shape on the surface she'd learned to expect. And whatever she was not a thing that simply waited. She came looking, closer than she had ever come, into the shallows below the harbour, along the rocks, into the little coves, nosing inshore in the dark, the way you'd search a house room by room for someone who wasn't answering. And one night, late, when the leg had healed just enough that he could get himself up out of the bed and lean in the open doorway of his cottage on a stick, breathing the cold, clean salt air, because he could not bear another hour of only looking at it. One night he was standing there, in the dark, gazing out at the water he'd built his whole life beside, and out past the near rocks, low in the black swell, something surfaced, and stopped, and looked toward the one lit window on the whole low shore. He didn't dare believe it at first. He stood very still, and then, slowly, he lifted the little bell down from its nail by the door. He'd kept it there for years, the great triumph of that first year, and he rang it. Once, out into the dark, the sound went out over the water, and the shape came in. She came right up to the shingle, closer to land than she had ever let herself be, into water so shallow it barely covered her. And she looked up the beach at him, standing broken in his doorway with the lamp behind him. And Corin came down the shingle as fast as a man on a mending leg and a stick could go, which was not fast at all. And he sat down heavily on the cold stones at the very edge of the sea, and she came the last of the way to him, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. She'd found him. That was all. She'd gone looking, and she'd found him, and after that, things were a little different, and a little better, because it turned out there was another way to do it. On the quiet nights, the still ones, when the harbour was asleep and there was no one on the wall and no lantern moving anywhere along the shore, she would come inshore to his own beach, into the deep water, close under the low rock below his cottage, and he would come down to meet her. Not every night. She was careful, and so was he, and the world had to be exactly empty and exactly quiet before either of them would chance it. But often enough that the long walk out and the boat and the open water became just one of the ways they had. rather than the only one. And it suited him in the end better than he'd have believed, because his whole cozy little house was right there. Warm and close, 10 steps up the shingle, full of things. He could go back and forth. He'd think of something in the night and go up and fetch it and bring it down to show her. A curl of orange peel, a cracked glass float, a candle burning inside a jar so she could see how the fire lived in there without ever touching the water. He could go up and get his coat when the wind came round and come back down, and she'd still be there. On the very cold nights, he'd sit in his own doorway with the fire at his back and the door open to the sea. And she'd lie out in the shallows just at the edge of the lamplight, and sometimes she sang, low, and it went up the beach and into the house and into the middle of him, the same as it always had. That is where the book more or less leaves them, dear friend, and I find I don't mind that it does. A man in a warm doorway by the sea he loved past all sense, a shape in the dark water below, come inshore on the quiet nights. A little bell hung by the door to be rung when the world was empty enough, and a promise made once low over the side of a boat, kept and going on being kept, for no reason at all, except that some things are only safe as long as nobody knows them, and he'd decided, early and for good, to be the one who never told. Nobody found out. Nobody ever did. And that, when you take the talking out of it, is most of what a friendship is. Somebody was looked after. Somebody kept the secret. And the two of them went on meeting in the quiet, the way they'd begun. She coming up out of the silence, him waiting in it, for as long as they liked. There, that's where I'll leave it, right where the book does, with the door open and the water dark, and neither of them going anywhere just yet. And I meant what I said at the start. The harbour isn't named. The coast isn't named. And I'd be very surprised if Corin was the name on his door. Whoever set this down took the trouble to leave out every single thing that might let a person go and look. The book keeps the very silence the man kept. It does the thing it's about, all the way down. I do rather love it when they manage that. I'll tuck it back into its nook, just there where the shelves bend toward the water and the salt tails gather. And not somewhere obvious, if you don't mind. Somewhere it'll take a good long while and a lucky evening to come across again. That seems the right way to keep it. Then I think I'll stay down here a while, by the wellspring, with my feet in the water, and the lamp turned low. The river's gone flat and quiet tonight, the way it only does on the very best ones. And it seems a shame to waste it. You're welcome to stay as long as you like. The bank doesn't mind. It never has. Nothing left for you to look after tonight, dear friend. No secret to keep. Nothing to carry. Nothing anyone needs you to hold on to until morning. Let your hands go loose. And let the quiet come in the way it came in for him. Not the lost kind, out in the fog, but the other kind. The settled kind. The kind that waits in a warm doorway by the sea and asks nothing of you at all and beckons you gently down. Sleep well. I'll leave the lamp lit and the door open a crack, I think, tonight, just in case. Good night.